Welcome to the LDN radio show, brought to you by the LDN Research Trust. I'm your host, Linda Elsiegood. I have an exciting lineup of guest speakers who are LDN experts in their field. We will be discussing low-dose naltrexone and its many uses in autoimmune diseases, cancers, etc. Thank you for joining us. Today we're joined by Dr Yusuf Saleeby, also known as JP. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey Linda, it's always a pleasure.
Now you're going to talk to us today about COVID and long COVID haulers. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Sure. So, 2 years into the pandemic, we're seeing still a few cases of acute COVID infections, but, as of today, and this is the 1st of March, we are not seeing too many acute cases, but what we are seeing is quite a number of long haulers or long COVID and also post-COVID syndrome. It's also referred to as, the syndrome of post-acute COVID infection and the sequelae involved. And we are seeing also some issues with folks who have been vaccinated, some post-vaccine injury. But essentially what's happening is we're seeing a good bit of folks who can't shake the initial COVID infections. And we've seen cases where a person has been infected 2 or even 3 times with different variants. But the focus in general right now moving forward is a large number of folks coming in with the post-COVID infection and some still suffering from long haulers. And there's a protocol we follow. The FLCCC has a very relevant protocol that's fairly frequently updated based on this new science coming in and peer-reviewed articles. And that's kind of what we adhere to, with a few modifications. We're a little bit more aggressive with some of the dietary supplements that we prescribe. But essentially, low-dose naltrexone, which was offered as a second or third line agent, has now in the recent month been moved up to a primary intervention. So along with things like ivermectin and prednisone, and omega-3 fatty acids, which is essentially, what's derived from fish oil, and vitamin D, high doses of vitamin D. The other agent is naltrexone, as in low-dose naltrexone. And they're asking folks to begin at 1 milligram daily and increase to 4.5 milligrams in a very short period of time. They are also stating that it's best to have people on this for 2 to 3 months to see full effect. So as with some of the other interventions, like they're recommending ivermectin weight dose dosing, which is 0.2 milligrams per kilogram body weight, until symptoms resolve, not necessarily for 14 days or 1 month, but until symptoms resolve. And the same thing can be said for the use of low-dose naltrexone. In my patient base, a lot of my patients actually are on it for a number of reasons, whether they're suffering from Lyme disease or autoimmune disease. So my patients actually have a benefit of being on LDN at the therapeutic dose, whether it's 3.5 to 4.5 milligrams a day. So they have the benefit of that. And then if they do get COVID, their symptoms are usually quite less. We've not really had but 1 or 2 hospitalizations. The stays are usually very short, maybe 2 to 4 days just for high flow oxygen, and then they're discharged home. To my knowledge, we've only had 1 or 2 patients ventilated during this whole pandemic. So, adherence to early treatment and the implementation of naltrexone as part of that regimen has been very successful for us. And now our attention is now focusing on folks that have long haulers, still brain fog, fatigue, loss of smell and taste are the predominant ones. Hair loss, we're seeing that as part of the syndrome, but it's mostly the fatigue. And so naltrexone is becoming a big part of our protocol for them.
Mm-hmm. And how open-minded are other physicians to prescribing LDN?
Well, it's like a certain segment of the physician population, at least in the United States. I don't know how it is worldwide, but there seems to be better embracing the use of low-dose naltrexone than other interventions like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, because those two other agents have been politicized a bit, whereas naltrexone has not. But there are certainly other, interventions that are embraced by folks that are open-minded to integrative, more holistic, and what we call functional medicine than are the standard mainstream medical doctors. Although the FLCCC, in truth, is actually established by conventional doctors who were open to using early treatment with ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, Alinea, or nitroxoxide, along with their traditional medications like prednisone, Singulair, some antihistamines, Pepcid, things like that are used in the protocol. But what they've also introduced is things like curcumin, Nigella sativa, which is the extract of black cumin seed oil, which is a very potent anti-inflammatory, higher doses of vitamin C, melatonin, probiotics, and H2 and H1 receptor blockers. H1 would be your traditional antihistamines like Benadryl or Zyrtec or Claritin, and your H2 would be things like Pepcid, famotidine, and some of those other agents. Montelukast, which is Singulair, is also prescribed for those with MCAS, that's mast cell activation syndrome, which is part of the long haulers syndrome. It's where mast cells become destabilized and release a lot of histamine. So you have things like hives and rashes that appear, and some other complications. And that's why the antihistamines and the leukotriene inhibitor Singulair are used. There are some that will use anti-androgen therapies. There were some studies out of Brazil that showed that that was effective, as well as statins. I'm not a big fan of either of those two last agents, so I don't prescribe them in my protocols for my patients. But there's another SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, called fluvoxamine, or brand name Luvox, which has been used, but it's not very well tolerated. So that's one that we have to be super careful with, because a lot of folks don't tolerate, they have a lot of nausea or psychiatric kind of manifestations. But LDN obviously is a great agent to use, because number one, it's very well tolerated. Number two, it's very inexpensive, and it seems to be working very well. I mean, it was moved up from second and third tier to primary tier or primary agent to use by the FLCCC. And they're heavily research oriented. In other words, they don't make a move in that direction unless it's substantiated by large observational encounters with patients or peer-reviewed journals.
So the million-dollar question, put you on the hot spot here. What do you think that has done for LDN? Has it leapfrogged it forward far quicker than it would have done previously? And the second part of the question is, what do you think all of everything that's been happening with using LDN for the symptoms of fatigue, what's it going to do to people with chronic fatigue syndrome?
Right. So yeah, I certainly think that the pandemic has elevated LDN to top of mind for a lot of clinicians, both those that have been using it and were familiar with it to some degree in the realms of integrative and functional medicine, but also to the mainstream doctors who were unaware of LDN previous to the pandemic. Now it's front and center. I mean, it's one of 4 or 5 interventions that are considered top tier to use for people with recovering from long haulers or post-COVID syndrome. So I think it did leapfrog it. I mean, in the minds of many doctors, to be put top of mind, that's a fantastic thing. That's a kind of a good thing that came out of this horrible pandemic, if you will. Mm-hmm. And the second question you had was what its effects on chronic fatigue. Well, I've been using that in chronic fatigue and autoimmune patients and people with MSIDS, MSIDS, or CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. Those are all different acronyms for almost the same essential issue. It's a syndrome that involves the immune system and inflammation. And we know that LDN and naltrexone in research is an anti-inflammatory from several different mechanisms. It helps suppress inflammation. And the post-COVID syndrome and certainly the long haulers is a problem mostly with inflammation. The virus is long gone. It's already out of our system, usually 9 to 14 days after you first get infected. The virus has done its bad thing and it's sort of kind of gone away. And what's left is the sequelae of that, which is lots of inflammation. And that's what actually hurts people. It destroys their lungs and other organs, liver, kidneys, things like that, and affects brain and cognitive issues and things like that. So one of the interventions that are used is high dose of curcumin and black cumin seed oil. Those are potent anti-inflammatories. Even those that decide to use statins, they're using it for the anti-inflammatory nature of the statin, like atorvastatin. But then LDN comes in, which is a very safe and effective mechanism of lowering inflammation. I think that's why it's important.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just hope that, as you say, a good thing has come out of this. And if we can get more doctors prescribing LDN and finding the benefits that patients have, hopefully they will prescribe it for more conditions, mental health, autoimmune, cancer, pain, the list goes on. But I think it does make a big difference the first time a doctor actually can see that LDN has done amazing things for a patient. It gives them the encouragement and the confidence to prescribe it for further patients. So,
right,
fingers crossed.
Definitely. And Linda, your website does a phenomenal job, in helping me put together a PowerPoint presentation for your organization as well as for an upcoming symposium I have. I've gone to your website, which is a great resource, and it lists all the different conditions that LDN is being used for or would be useful for, based on these long lists of conditions categorized, pulmonary, neuropsychiatric, cardiovascular. You've done a great job in enumerating all these conditions. And I think it's just a matter of time now for doctors to start embracing that, looking at the literature, looking at the peer-reviewed literature that backs up the use of this agent, very unusual drug. It's one of my, probably the top 5 of my safe and effective drugs that I prescribe. And that's what I would grab. I tell my patients, if I had to grab an agent to take to me with me on a deserted island, one of the top 3 would be naltrexone for the LDN. Mm-hmm. So, it's a powerful drug with a lot of uses, and it's backed up by research. That's the important thing.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the website, we do update it monthly. So any doctor that tells us of a condition that they've treated a patient for with LDN and had good results, that's not on our list, we add it. We also add the latest clinical trials and peer-reviewed papers and LDN in the news, things that have been happening. So we try and make it a one-stop where, a doctor, a researcher, a pharmacist who's looking to do a presentation, just like you were saying, that they can find the information quickly and easily. It's a never-ending job, but
I know it is. It's a great thing you offer, and I do send patients to that website in particular when we have a discussion in my office about LDN. And I have some material I hand out to them, but I also direct them to the LDN research Trust website so they can glean a lot of information. It's a great resource for them.
Mhm.
And I understand there's a new book coming out. Linda, you want to tell
Yes,
me
we've
about
got
that?
the third LDN book should be coming out in the fall. And we're covering different conditions. Many people have said, is it the first book updated the third time? No, it's a series of books. So we've got volume 1 and 2. Now we've got volume 3. And you put me on the spot to try and think what's in volume 3. But it's really exciting, and you've written a chapter as well. So I think watch this space, and it will be available
very good.
in a few months.
I mean, reading volume 1 and volume 2, I thought, well, maybe that would be just an update, like a second edition, but it wasn't. It was some novel things that were discussed in volume 2. And I'm assuming that, like you say, volume 3 will be more novel stuff. Yeah.
Well, the whole idea is to every volume to cover conditions that haven't been covered in the previous books, where we have the latest research. And if there are, we will have a section, so the latest papers will be referenced at the back. I mean, we have every book, hundreds of references. And of course, as time goes on, every year there are more papers coming out, which is fantastic.
Right.
The LDN Research Trust has been going over 18 years now. And initially, published papers were slow coming through. But, you know, every month there is something somewhere in the world, somebody's done something, had something published. So it is gathering momentum, which is fantastic.
And Linda, I think really with the last 2 years of us being in a pandemic, where a lot of focus has been on COVID-19 and what we can do for it with, let's say, off-label use of certain medications and LDN, that's going to even push more research money towards researching LDN, I'm sure. Now that it's on the protocol and it's like in the #1 section of early interventions, for long haulers, I think you'll see probably more and more papers. Actually, it should be exponential in the number of researchers wanting to take this on and do more research, for sure.
Well, fingers crossed.
So Linda, I've got a case that's a very interesting case that I saw in my office a few months ago. And this is actually a post-COVID vaccine injury type case. Now, this lady, unbeknownst to her, had an underlying tick-borne infection. She actually had Lyme disease that was activated by the first dose of the COVID vaccine. I'm not going to mention which one it was, but it was a first in a series of 2 that she received. And within 48 hours of receiving the first dose, and then for the subsequent week and to 2 weeks thereafter, she suffered some neurological conditions that put her in a wheelchair. So this is a woman, and she was in her late 40s, and she was very ambulatory, you know, didn't really claim any health issues. Next thing you know, within a very short period after her first vaccination, she was wheelchair bound. Couldn't walk, and had a very staggering kind of staccato, almost looked like a Parkinsonian kind of gait. It took her, you know, literally 3 minutes to get up out of the wheelchair and walk a few steps across the room to the doorway of my office. Now, we put her on a pretty heavy duty protocol involving a few off-label drugs, but also I rapidly escalated her dose. She was never on LDN, but I placed her on low-dose naltrexone and escalated her dose pretty quickly because I knew time is of the essence here, and I didn't want her neurological problem to progress. And during that time, it was when we discovered that she had Lyme disease as an underlying etiology, and it was just exacerbated by probably the S spike proteins in the mRNA vaccine. But so we were able to get her rapidly up to 4.5 milligrams, which she tolerated very well. And the second time I saw her, she had transitioned from a wheelchair to a walker. On the third visit, which was a month later, she was using a cane. Now, she was able to ambulate without the use of any help, like a cane or even family members. But again, it was extremely slow with her ambulation. And it looked kind of almost Parkinsonian in nature, kind of like this leaning forward, kind of unsure. Took her a long time to actually turn. But once she initiated the walk, she could carry on her gait. And it was a little bit slow. But now I have not seen her back in about a month or two. She should have an appointment with me again soon. But I thought that was a pretty interesting case where I'm pretty sure that the naltrexone had a big part to play.
Well, thank you very much for having shared your experience with us today.
Well, Linda, it's always a pleasure. Have me back anytime. It's always good seeing you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments you may have, please email me, Linda, Linda, at ldnrt.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated your company. Until next time, stay safe and keep well.